50 tuxedo-clad guests watched in horror as the muddy, shivering boy was dragged toward the heavy bronze doors of the pinnacle. Julian Thorne, the city's most celebrated architect, pointed a manicured finger at the intruder, his voice booming with the kind of authority that usually ends conversations. "Get this filth out of my sight," he commanded, while his stepson's cruel laughter echoed off the pristine marble walls. They thought it was over. They thought the boy was just another street kid looking for a handout in the wrong neighborhood. But they were wrong. As the security guards hauled him away, and his battered backpack was kicked into the decorative fountain, sinking into the crystal-clear water, no one noticed what spilled out. No one saw the ink beginning to bleed on the pages of an old, water-damaged sketchbook. And Julian Thorne had no idea that in exactly 60 seconds, one glance at a single, ruined drawing would bring him to his knees, shattering his perfect life forever. Because the boy hadn't come for money. He hadn't come to beg. He had come to return a memory that Julian had spent 18 years trying to kill. And now, it was floating to the surface. The rain didn't just fall on Chicago that night. It assaulted the city, hammering against the 60-foot glass walls of the pinnacle like 1,000 fists demanding entry. Inside, however, the storm was nothing more than a silent, scenic backdrop for the city's elite. The air in the grand atrium smelled of expensive orchid arrangements and the distinct, crisp scent of money. Julian Thorne stood at the center of it all, a glass of vintage champagne resting lightly in his manicured hand. At 50, Julian was a man carved from the same cold, unyielding granite as his buildings. He adjusted his silk tie, his eyes scanning the crowd of senators, tech moguls, and socialites. They were all there to worship his latest creation, a 90-story testament to architectural perfection. Tonight was flawless. The lighting was precise. The string quartet was playing Debussy at exactly the right volume, and the world was finally acknowledging him as the visionary he knew he was. Then, a ripple of disturbance moved through the room, starting near the heavy bronze security doors. It wasn't a loud noise, just a sudden, uncomfortable shift in the atmosphere. Conversations died out like candles blown out by a draft. Heads turned. Julian frowned, the small imperfection in his evening irritating him more than it should have. He followed the gaze of the room toward the entrance. A boy stood there. He looked like a bruise on a perfect apple. He couldn't have been more than 17, drowned in an oversized, waterlogged gray hoodie that dripped filthy rainwater onto the pristine Italian marble floor. His jeans were torn at the knees, not the fashionable tears of a designer brand, but the jagged, threadbare rips of poverty. He was shivering violently, clutching a battered canvas backpack against his chest as if it contained gold bars. Security had clearly slipped up. The boy's sneakers squeaked loudly, an obscene sound in the hushed elegance of the hall, as he took a step forward. "Mr. Thorne," the boy rasped. His voice was raw, cracking under the weight of exhaustion. He didn't sound like a beggar. He sounded like someone who had been screaming for days. I need to show you." Julian didn't move. He simply stared, his expression hardening into a mask of disgust. It wasn't pity he felt. It was an intense annoyance. This boy was a stain, a glitch in his carefully coded reality. Before the boy could take another step, a figure in a midnight blue tuxedo intercepted him. It was Bryce, Julian's 18-year-old stepson. Bryce moved with the aggressive, jerky energy of someone who was constantly terrified of not being noticed. He had spent the entire evening trying to catch Julian's eye, trying to prove he belonged at the head table. Now he saw his chance. "You lost trash?" Bryce's voice carried across the room, loud enough for the press to hear, loud enough for Julian to hear. He planted himself between the boy and Julian, his chest puffed out. Service entrance is in the alley. This is for people who actually matter. The boy, Leo, didn't back down. He looked up at Bryce, water dripping from his matted hair into eyes that burned with a terrifying intensity. "Get out of my way," Leo said, his voice low and dangerous. "I'm not here for money. I'm here for him." He pointed a shaking finger at Julian. "Don't point at him," Bryce snapped. He shoved Leo hard. Leo stumbled back, his wet sneakers losing traction on the polished stone. He flailed, trying to regain his balance, but he was weak, likely from hunger or cold. He went down hard, his hip hitting the low marble rim of the decorative indoor fountain. The canvas backpack slipped from his grip. Time seemed to slow down. Leo lunged for it, a desperate guttural cry tearing from his throat, but he was too late. The bag hit the water. It didn't just float, it was heavy with papers, and it began to sink immediately, dark ink already starting to bleed into the crystal clear water. "No!" Leo screamed. It was a sound of pure devastation, the kind of sound a mother makes when she loses a child. He didn't care about the crowd anymore. He didn't care about the security guards rushing toward him. He plunged his hands into the freezing water, fishing frantically for the bag, soaking his sleeves, ruining the water feature, making a scene that was utterly humiliating. Bryce laughed. It was a nervous, high-pitched sound, looking back at Julian for approval. "Oops, looks like your garbage needs a wash anyway." The room was dead silent. 50 wealthy guests watched in horror, not at the cruelty, but at the awkwardness of it all. Julian Thorne finally moved. He walked slowly toward the commotion, the crowd parting for him like the Red Sea. He stopped 5 feet away, careful not to let the splashing water touch his Italian leather shoes. He looked down at Leo, who was now clutching the dripping, ruined bag to his chest, shivering uncontrollably on the floor. Leo looked up. Their eyes met. For a second, Julian felt a strange, cold shiver run down his spine, a phantom sensation he couldn't name. The boy's eyes were fierce, intelligent, and filled with a hatred so pure it was almost palpable. "You?" Leo whispered, teeth chattering. She said you would listen." Julian's face remained stone. He turned his gaze to the head of security, who had finally arrived, breathless and terrified. "Mr. Thorne, sir, I'm so sorry. He slipped through the catering truck." "I don't care how he got in," Julian said, his voice smooth, calm, and utterly heartless. He didn't look at Leo. He didn't look at the ruined bag. He looked at the stain on his floor. "Just get this filth out of my building and call the police. I want him charged with trespassing and destruction of property." "But sir," Leo choked out, water and tears mixing on his face. "Please, it's the sketches. It's the only proof. My mom." "Get him out," Julian repeated, turning his back on the boy. "Now, before he contaminates the air conditioning." As the guards grabbed Leo by the arms and hauled him up, dragging him backward toward the exit, Julian adjusted his cuffs. He looked at Bryce, who was waiting for a "well done." Julian gave him a curt nod. "Next time, Bryce," Julian said coldly. "Handle the pest control before it enters the room. Don't make a show of it." He walked away, leaving his stepson crestfallen and his biological son screaming in the grip of strangers, dragging a wet trail of ink and rainwater across the most expensive floor in Chicago. Julian thought the problem was solved. He had no idea he had just ordered the destruction of his own soul. The arrival of the Chicago Police Department was swift, efficient, and loud. Two officers strode through the revolving glass doors, their uniforms jarringly utilitarian against the black-tie elegance of the gala. The flashing blue and red lights from the patrol cars outside washed over the limestone walls in a dizzying, nausea-inducing rhythm, turning the architectural masterpiece into a crime scene. Julian watched from a distance, arms crossed, his face a mask of bored irritation. He just wanted the boy gone. He wanted the air to return to its previous stillness so he could go back to accepting compliments about the cantilevered terraces on the 45th floor. "Stop struggling, son," one of the officers said, his voice booming in the acoustic perfection of the lobby. He spun Leo around, pressing the boy's chest against a marble pillar. The click of handcuffs was sharp and final. That sound, metal biting into metal, seemed to snap something inside Leo. The boy didn't slump in defeat. Instead, he twisted his head around, his neck straining, his eyes locking onto Julian with a ferocity that made several guests step back. "You think you're a god?" Leo screamed. The raw, scraping volume of his voice tore through the polite murmurs of the crowd. "My mother told me you were a genius. She told me you built worlds out of nothing." Julian sighed, signaling for Marcus, his longtime attorney and oldest friend, to handle the liability issues. He turned to walk away. "But she was wrong." Leo's shout followed him, desperate and breaking. "You're not a builder. You're a thief. You stole the future. You stole us." Julian stopped. The accusation was absurd, the rambling of a disturbed mind. Yet the word "us" hung in the air, heavy and strange. "Check his pockets," the officer muttered, reaching for the soaking wet waistband of Leo's jeans. "Get off me," Leo thrashed, and with a burst of hysterical strength, he managed to kick the soggy, ruined backpack that lay on the floor near his feet. He didn't just kick it. He launched it across the polished floor. It slid like a hockey puck on ice, leaving a streak of muddy water before coming to a rest just inches from Julian's tuxedo shoes. The impact caused the cheap zipper to burst. Julian looked down, intending to kick the debris aside. But he froze. The contents had spilled out. It wasn't a bomb. It wasn't a weapon. It was a stack of sketchbooks, their wire bindings rusted, their pages swollen with water. The top book had flopped open, the paper heavy and translucent from the soak in the fountain. The ink was bleeding, dark lines dissolving into gray clouds, but the image was still visible. It wasn't a sketch of a skyscraper. It was a house. A glass house, nestled in a valley of ferns, with a roof that curved like the wing of a sleeping bird. It was a structure that defied gravity. Impossibly light, impossibly romantic. The breath left Julian's lungs in a violent rush. The room, the guests, the police, it all vanished. He knew that curve. He knew the specific pressure of the charcoal pencil required to create that shadow under the eaves. He knew it because his own hand had drawn it. 18 years ago. In a drafty studio apartment in Brooklyn that smelled of turpentine and cheap red wine. He fell to his knees. The movement was so abrupt, so uncharacteristic of the poised billionaire, that a collective gasp went through the crowd. Julian didn't hear them. He reached out, his fingers trembling, and touched the wet page. He ignored the mud. He ignored the ruin. He carefully peeled back the sodden cover to look at the bottom corner of the drawing. The water had blurred the writing, but the inscription was burned into his memory. For Maya, the only home I'll ever need. And below it, his own signature. Not the sharp corporate autograph he used on contracts today, but the looping, artistic signature of a 22-year-old dreamer who thought love was enough to sustain a life. "Maya," Julian whispered. The name tasted like ash in his mouth. Julian? Marcus stepped up beside him, his voice low and urgent. Julian, get up. People are filming. What is this? Julian didn't answer. He turned the page with the reverence one would show a holy relic. The next drawing was a portrait. It was unfinished, a quick charcoal study of a woman sleeping, her hair fanned out on a pillow, her hand resting protectively over a slightly swollen belly. The date in the corner was 2 weeks before he had left New York. 2 weeks before he had chosen the scholarship in London, the career, the ambition, and ghosted the girl who waited tables to buy him art supplies. He said, Julian's voice shook, barely audible. He said she sent him. Marcus looked down at the sketch, then up at the boy being dragged toward the squad car. The lawyer's eyes narrowed behind his spectacles. He looked at Leo, really looked at him for the first time. He saw the sharp jawline, the way the boy's hair curled at the nape of the neck, and the eyes, those intense, amber-flecked eyes that burned with a creative, destructive fire. Marcus grabbed Julian's shoulder, his grip painful. Julian, look at the boy. Julian looked up. The police were wrestling Leo through the revolving doors. The boy wasn't fighting anymore. He was limp, his head hanging, defeated. But as the flashing light swept across his face, the resemblance hit Julian with the force of a physical blow. It wasn't just a resemblance. It was a mirror. He was looking at his own ghost, young and angry and betrayed, being hauled away in handcuffs by his own command. Cognitive dissonance roared in Julian's skull. The narrative of his life, that he was a self-made man who owed nothing to anyone, shattered. He hadn't just left a girlfriend behind, he had left a life. He had left a son. Wait! The shout didn't sound like it came from a CEO. It sounded like it came from a man falling off a cliff. Julian scrambled to his feet, slipping on the wet floor, abandoning all dignity. He clutched the ruined sketchbook to his chest, the wet charcoal staining his white shirt, ruining the silk, branding him with his past. Stop the car, Julian roared, running toward the doors, shoving past a stunned Bryce, shoving past the security guards. Don't you dare take him! The guests stood paralyzed, champagne glasses forgotten. They watched the King of New York run out into the rain, chasing a police car like a madman, clutching a bundle of wet paper as if it were the only thing in the world that could save him from drowning. The heavy oak doors of the Pinnacle burst open, and Julian Thorne sprinted into the deluge. He didn't wait for a valet. He didn't wait for an umbrella. He ran straight into the chaotic traffic of Fifth Avenue. His patent leather shoes slapping against the asphalt, his tuxedo instantly soaked to a heavy, clinging black skin. The police cruiser was already pulling away, its lights cutting through the sheets of rain like strobe lights in a nightmare. Stop! Julian roared, waving his arms. He didn't look like a billionaire architect anymore. He looked like a madman. He threw himself directly into the path of the vehicle, forcing the officer behind the wheel to slam on the brakes. The car skidded on the slick pavement, screeching to a halt inches from Julian's knees. Officer Miller rolled down the window, furious, until he recognized the man standing in his headlights. Mr. Thorne, Jesus, are you trying to get killed? Julian didn't answer. He ripped the rear door of the cruiser open. Leo was huddled in the back seat, shivering against the hard plastic divider. When the door opened, he flinched, curling into a defensive ball. But when he saw Julian, breathless, soaked, with the ruined sketchbook still clutched in one hand, his expression shifted from fear to a cold, hard calculation. Get out, Julian commanded, his voice shaking. He turned to the officer. The charges are dropped. He's with me. Sir, we can't just... I said he is with me. Julian's voice cracked, a sound of authority fracturing under panic. Leave us. He didn't wait for permission. He reached in and grabbed Leo by the arm, not roughly this time, but with a desperate grip, as if he were trying to keep the boy from evaporating. He pulled Leo out of the police car and dragged him toward his own waiting limousine, a black phantom idling at the curb. Once inside the hermetically sealed silence of the car, the roar of the city vanished. The air smelled of conditioned leather and Julian's expensive cologne, a stark contrast to the smell of river water and old sweat emanating from Leo. Julian looked at the boy. Up close, under the soft ambient lighting of the car, the truth was unavoidable. Leo had Maya's nose, but he had Julian's chin, the same stubborn set of the jaw that Julian saw in the mirror every morning. "Why didn't she tell me?" Julian asked. The question was a whisper, stripped of all arrogance. I would have sent money. I would have built her a house. I would have done anything. Leo sat on the edge of the plush leather seat, refusing to lean back. He wiped his nose with the back of his dirty sleeve. She didn't want your money. She wanted you to be the man she thought you were. She waited 18 years for you to come back. I didn't know, Julian pleaded. Leo, I swear to God, I didn't know you existed. Leo turned his head. His eyes were dry now, red-rimmed, but terrifyingly focused. My name isn't the point, and I'm not here for a reunion, Julian. He didn't use Dad. He used the name like a curse word. I'm here for a transaction. Julian blinked, confused. What? Leo pointed to the wet sketchbook on Julian's lap. That book, the copyright, the sketches. It's proof that you didn't design the glass house project alone. Proof that she was your muse, your partner. Julian stared at him. I don't care about the credit. You can have it all. I don't want the credit, Leo snapped, his voice rising. I want to sell it back to you, right now. Sell it? She's a county general, Leo said, the words coming out fast like bullets. Acute liver failure. Toxic exposure from the paints she used in that unventilated basement she calls a studio. The studio she worked in to pay for my school. Leo took a ragged breath, checking the cheap digital watch on his wrist. The doctors said she has maybe 30 minutes before the toxins hit her brainstem, before she slips into a coma she won't wake up from. The silence in the car was deafening. Julian felt the blood drain from his face. She needs a transplant, Leo continued, his voice trembling for the first time. But she has no insurance, no status. They put her on the bottom of the list. They're letting her die because she's poor. He looked Julian dead in the eye. So buy the book. Give me the money. Get her the best surgeon in the city. Buy her a liver. I don't care how you do it. Just fix it. It wasn't a plea for love. It was a business deal from a son who had learned that in his father's world, everything had a price. Julian felt a wave of nausea. He fumbled for his phone, his wet fingers sliding over the screen. Driver, he yelled at the partition. County General, now, drive on the sidewalk if you have to. He dialed Dr. Aris, the head of surgery at Mount Sinai, a man he played golf with on Sundays. Aris, listen to me. Julian barked into the phone, his voice echoing in the cabin. I need a liver, tonight, right now, for a 45-year-old female. Typo. I don't care what it costs. I'll fund a new wing. I'll build you a research center. Name your price. He listened. Leo watched him, holding his breath. Julian's face fell. The color drained away completely, leaving him gray. What do you mean you can't? I'm Julian Thorne. I don't care about the UNOS list. Bypass it. There has to be a way. He listened for another 10 seconds, then slowly lowered the phone. The line was still open, the doctor's voice tinny and apologetic on the other end. Julian looked at Leo. The power, the billions of dollars, the influence that could bend steel and zoning laws, it had all just hit a brick wall. They can't buy an organ, Julian whispered, the horror dawning on him. Not instantly. Even if I pay, there's no matching donor available. It takes days to clear the waiting list. Leo's face crumbled. The tough, street-smart exterior shattered. You're lying, he choked out. You're rich. You can do anything. You said you could build anything. I can't build time, Leo, Julian said, his voice breaking. We have to go. We have to be there. The car swerved through traffic, running red lights, carrying two men who had everything and nothing. Julian Thorne realized, for the first time in his life, that he was the poorest man in the world. He had a checkbook that could buy islands, but he couldn't buy the next 30 minutes. County General Hospital did not smell like orchids. It smelled of industrial bleach, dried blood, and the sour, metallic tang of desperate humanity. When Julian Thorne burst through the sliding doors, his tuxedo ruined and clinging to his frame, nobody looked up. In this place, a wet billionaire was just another body in the way of a gurney. Leo didn't wait for him. The boy moved through the chaotic triage center with the muscle memory of someone who had spent too many nights sleeping in plastic chairs, dodging nurses, and weaving through the maze of misery to the elevator bank. Julian followed, his expensive leather soles slipping on the linoleum. For the first time in decades, he was following someone else's lead. They reached the 4th floor. Critical care. It was quieter here, but the silence was heavier. It was the silence of machines breathing for people who could no longer breathe for themselves. Leo stopped abruptly in front of room 404. He hesitated, his hand hovering over the push plate, his shoulders trembling. He looked back at Julian, and the hardness in his eyes was gone, replaced by a terrified vulnerability. Don't look at her like she's a tragedy, Leo whispered, a fierce protective warning. She's still beautiful. He pushed the door open. Julian stepped inside, and his heart hammered a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He was prepared for anger, for tears, for shouting. He was not prepared for the quiet devastation of the woman in the bed. Maya was small. The hospital gown swallowed her frame, making her look like a child. Her skin, once the warm olive tone he had spent hours trying to capture with charcoal, was now a shocking, deep saffron yellow, the unmistakable mark of a liver that had ceased to function. Her dark hair was thin, spread like ink across the pillow. Mom? Leo's voice broke into 1,000 pieces. He rushed to the bedside, dropping to his knees, taking her hand, a hand that was swollen and bruised from IV lines, and pressing it to his cheek. Julian stood frozen at the foot of the bed. The cognitive dissonance roared back. This was the woman who had laughed with him in the rain in Brooklyn. This was the woman he had promised to build a castle for. And now she was dying in a room with peeling paint and flickering fluorescent lights, destroyed by the very toxins she used to paint the beauty he had abandoned. A doctor entered the room. He looked exhausted, his scrubs wrinkled, a stethoscope hanging loosely around his neck. He didn't recognize Julian, or if he did, he didn't care. You're the family, the doctor asked, looking at Leo. Son, we talked about this. Her ammonia levels are spiking. If we don't find a match. I'm the father, Julian interrupted. The words felt foreign, heavy. He stepped forward, radiating the command he used in boardrooms. I am Julian Thorne. I want to donate. Test me. Now. The doctor looked him up and down, taking in the wet tuxedo, the desperation. Mr. Thorne, it's not that simple. We need to check blood type, tissue markers, cross-matching. I'm O positive, Julian snapped. Same as her, I remember. We gave blood together once in college. Just test me. The desperation in the room shifted. A spark of hope lit up Leo's face. He looked at Julian, eyes widening. Maybe, that look said, maybe you aren't useless. Take him, Leo pleaded to the doctor. Please. The next hour was a blur of needles, scans, and rapid-fire questions. Julian threw his weight around, demanding the lab expedite the results, threatening to buy the hospital, promising endowments. For an hour, he felt powerful again. He was doing something. He was fixing it. But when the doctor returned to the small waiting room, he wasn't holding a consent form. He was holding a clipboard, and he wouldn't meet Julian's eyes. Well? Julian stood up, buttoning his jacket. When do we start? I'm ready. We can't use you, Mr. Thorne, the doctor said quietly. The air left the room. What? Julian laughed, a sharp, incredulous bark. I'm a match. I know I am. You are a blood match, the doctor admitted. But your liver is compromised. The ultrasound shows significant steatosis, fatty liver disease. The doctor looked at Julian's waistline, at the expensive watch. The signs of a life lived with rich food, aged scotch, and no restraint. It's not viable for transplant. If we put a piece of your liver in her, it would fail within days. You can't save her. Julian stood there, his mouth slightly open. The verdict hit him harder than any bankruptcy, any lawsuit, any market crash. His success, the 5-star dinners, the celebratory whiskeys, the life of excess he had built as a reward for his genius, had literally poisoned him. His wealth hadn't made him strong, it had made him useless. No, Leo whispered. The boy was standing by the vending machine in the corner. He slid down the wall until he hit the floor, burying his face in his hands. It wasn't a scream this time. It was a silent, racking sob that shook his entire body. The hope that had flared up was extinguished, leaving the room darker than before. Julian looked at his hands. Soft, manicured, useless. He had billions in the bank, and he couldn't buy the one thing his son needed. He was the poorest man in the room. Is there anyone else? Julian asked, his voice hollow. Money is no object. I'll fly anyone in. There's no time, the doctor said, checking his watch. She has maybe an hour before the toxins cause irreversible brain damage. We need a donor in the building, prepped right now. And unless you have a relative with O negative or O positive blood who lives like a monk. The doctor trailed off, shaking his head, and walked away to attend to a patient he could actually save. Julian turned to comfort Leo, but he stopped. Standing in the doorway of the waiting room was Bryce. Julian's stepson was still in his midnight blue tuxedo, but he looked small. He had followed the limousine. He had come here ready to drag his mother home, ready to sneer at the trash. But Bryce wasn't sneering. He was staring at Leo, the boy he had shoved, the boy he had called garbage, curled up on the dirty linoleum, crying for his mother. Bryce looked at Julian, saw the defeat in the powerful man's posture. For the first time in his life, Bryce saw the cracks in the facade. He saw that the perfect family portrait was a lie, and the messy, tragic reality in front of him was the only thing that was real. Bryce took a step into the room. He didn't say a word. He just uncapped a bottle of water he had bought from the cafeteria and silently placed it on the floor next to Leo. It was a clumsy, awkward gesture. but in the suffocating despair of the room. It was the only bridge left standing. The silence in the waiting room was no longer empty. It was heavy, suffocating, pressing down on the three men like a physical weight. Julian leaned against the wall, staring at the scuffed linoleum, his mind replaying the doctor's words. You can't save her. For all his skyscrapers, for all his legacy, he was structurally unsound. The sliding doors at the end of the corridor hissed open. Julian didn't look up. He assumed it was another nurse, another orderly, another bearer of bad news. But the rhythm of the footsteps was different. Sharp, deliberate, the click of high heels on tile that commanded attention rather than asked for it. Bryce was the first to look. His eyes widened. Mom. Julian's head snapped up. Elena Thorne stood in the doorway. She was still wearing her silver gala gown, but she had thrown a tan trench coat over it, belting it tightly as if holding herself together. Her hair, usually sprayed into an architectural helmet of perfection, was loose, windblown. She held a thick manila envelope in one hand and a hospital admission band in the other. She didn't look at Julian. She walked straight past him, past Bryce, and stopped in front of the exhausted doctor who was just exiting the nurse's station. I'm O-negative, Elena said. Her voice was calm, terrifyingly steady. I have no history of liver disease. I don't drink, and my BMI is 21. Here are my medical records from my physical last week. She slapped the envelope onto the counter. I'm the match. The doctor blinked, taken aback by the sudden apparition of this silver-clad woman. He picked up the file, flipping through it. Ma'am, even if you are a match, this is a major surgery. We need psychological evaluation, a cooling-off period. She has 40 minutes? Elena cut him off. She turned to look at the clock on the wall, then back at the doctor. You have a dying woman in room 404 and a willing, compatible donor standing right here. Do you want to waste time on paperwork? Or do you want to scrub in? Elena? Julian stepped forward, his voice trembling. He felt a surge of confusion so profound it made him dizzy. What are you doing? Elena finally turned to him. Her face was pale, devoid of makeup, revealing the fine lines of age and sadness she usually hid so well. I'm doing what you couldn't, Julian. I'm fixing it. But why? Julian reached for her hand, but she pulled away. You hate her. You don't even know her. You think she ruined our night. I don't care about her, Elena said, her voice dropping to a whisper that cut through the room. And I certainly don't care about your guilty conscience. She shifted her gaze. She looked down at Leo. The boy was still sitting on the floor, the water bottle Bryce had given him clutched in his hands. He stared up at Elena with wide, bewildered eyes, like a stray dog expecting a kick and getting a bone instead. Elena's expression softened. It wasn't a smile. It was a crack in the porcelain. Look at him, Julian, she said softly. Really look at him. He's terrified. He's 17 years old, and he's watching the only person who loves him fade away. She took a step toward Leo. When we lost Christopher, the name hung in the air like smoke. Christopher, the son they had lost 10 years ago to leukemia. The topic was forbidden in the Thorne household. It was the foundation of their silence, the ghost haunting their marriage. When Christopher was dying, Elena continued, her eyes locking onto Leo's, I prayed every night for a donor. I prayed for a miracle. I prayed for a stranger to walk through the door and save my baby. A single tear tracked down her cheek, unheeded. Nobody came. No one saved him. She turned back to Julian, her eyes blazing with a fierce, ancient pain. I can't save my son. He's gone. But I can save his. She pointed a manicured finger at Leo. I will not let another mother die leaving a boy alone in the dark. I am not doing this for you. I am doing this because I am a mother, and I know exactly how heavy that silence is. Leo slowly stood up. He looked at this woman, this stranger in diamonds and silk, and he saw the scar tissue beneath the glamour. He swallowed hard. Thank you, he croaked. Elena nodded, a curt, professional motion. Don't thank me yet. Pray I have a good kidney function. Mom? Bryce stepped forward, his voice cracking. He looked young, stripped of his bully persona. Mom, it's dangerous. Something could happen. Elena reached out and cupped Bryce's face. I'll be fine. You look after him? She gestured to Leo. He's your brother now, whether you like it or not. Act like it. The surgical team arrived with a gurney, their urgency returning now that a solution was present. Mrs. Thorne, we need to prep you immediately. We're going to bypass standard protocol due to the emergency status. Elena nodded. She began to untie the belt of her trench coat, preparing to shed the last layer of her armor. But before she climbed onto the gurney, she stopped. She twisted the large diamond solitaire ring on her left hand. It slid off with a little resistance. She took Julian's hand and pressed the cold metal into his palm. Elena, Julian started, tears streaming down his face. I love you. Hold on to that, she said, her voice devoid of sentimentality. If I don't wake up, bury me next to Christopher, not in the Thorne family crypt, next to my son. You're going to wake up? Julian insisted, gripping her hand. Just in case, she whispered. Then she looked at him with a clarity that terrified him. And Julian, if she lives, you owe her nothing. But you owe that boy everything. Don't build him a house. Build him a home. She let go of his hand. The nurses surrounded her, a flurry of blue scrubs and white sheets. Elena Thorne lay back on the gurney, staring up at the ceiling tiles, her face composing itself into a mask of calm determination. As they wheeled her through the double doors toward the operating theater, she didn't look back at her husband. She looked back at the boy in the dirty hoodie. And for a brief second, she smiled. The doors swung shut, leaving the three men, the father, the stepson, and the secret son, standing in the echoing hallway, bound together by the terrifying grace of a woman who had just walked into the fire for them. The ring in Julian's hand felt heavier than the skyscraper he had built. It felt like judgment. Time in a hospital waiting room does not tick, it drips. It accumulates like a heavy, viscous fluid, filling the room until breathing becomes a labor. 12 hours had passed since the double doors had swallowed Elena Thorne and Sarah Chen, the woman Julian married and the woman he abandoned. Outside, the Chicago storm had finally exhausted itself, leaving behind a gray, bruised dawn. Inside, under the relentless hum of fluorescent lights, 3 generations of men sat in a triangle of silence, each marooned on his own island of vinyl and chrome. Julian paced. He had walked the length of the corridor perhaps 200 times, his tuxedo jacket discarded, his dress shirt unbuttoned at the collar, the damp fabric drying stiff against his skin. In his left hand, he clutched Elena's diamond ring. He rubbed his thumb over the facets so obsessively that the skin was raw. Every time the elevator chimed, he flinched, expecting the worst. In the corner, near the vending machines, Leo sat on the floor. He had refused the chair. To him, comfort was a trap, The floor was honest. He had pulled a dry, half-used sketchbook from his back pocket. Not the ruined portfolio, but a small pad he kept for emergencies. His hand moved across the paper with a frenetic, jerky rhythm, the charcoal scratching loudly in the quiet room. Bryce sat on the opposite bench. The arrogance that had defined him at the gala was gone, peeled away by the long night. He looked like what he was, a teenager in a suit that was too expensive for him, waiting to see if his mother would survive her own bravery. Bryce watched Leo drawing. He watched the way Leo's hand moved, fast, violent, yet precise. Eventually, the curiosity outweighed the awkwardness. Bryce stood up, his joints popping, and walked slowly toward the vending machine. He bought a turkey sandwich, wrapped in plastic that crinkled loudly in the silence. He hesitated, then walked over to Leo. "Hey," Bryce said. His voice was rusty. Leo didn't look up. He kept shading, his brow furrowed in concentration. Bryce crouched down, ignoring the crease in his trousers. He held out the sandwich. "Eat it. My mom will kill me if you starve to death before she wakes up." Leo paused. The charcoal hovered over the paper. He looked at the sandwich, then up at Bryce. The hatred that had been there hours ago, the street kid defensiveness, had dulled into exhaustion. He took the sandwich. "Thanks," Leo mumbled. "What are you drawing?" Bryce asked, nodding at the pad. Leo flipped the pad around. It wasn't a building. It was a sketch of Bryce standing at the top of the stairs at the gala. But Leo hadn't drawn him as a villain or a bully. He had drawn him with strings attached to his wrists and ankles, leading up into a dark, undefined cloud above. Bryce's face in the drawing wasn't angry, it was terrified. He looked like a marionette who knew the show was over, but couldn't stop dancing. Bryce stared at the image. It was disturbing, it was insulting, and it was completely accurate. "Is that me?" Bryce asked softly. "It's how you looked," Leo said, taking a bite of the dry sandwich. "Like you were waiting for someone to pull the strings." Bryce let out a short, humorless laugh. He sat down on the floor next to Leo, leaning his head back against the wall. "Yeah, I guess that's about right." He looked over at Julian, who was still pacing, lost in his own purgatory. "He expects perfection. You don't know what it's like." "I know exactly what it's like," Leo replied, his eyes drifting to the closed surgical doors. "To be invisible until you're needed." For a moment, the barrier between the penthouse and the pavement vanished. They were just two sons, damaged by the same man's shadow, eating a stale sandwich on a hospital floor. Suddenly, the peace shattered. The double doors at the end of the hall burst open. The sound was violent, like a gunshot. Dr. Aris, the chief surgeon, stepped out. He wasn't walking with the slow, measured gait of a doctor delivering good news. He was rushing. His surgical gown was splattered with fresh, bright red blood. Too much blood. His mask was pulled down, revealing a face tight with panic. "Mr. Thorne!" Aris shouted. Julian spun around, nearly tripping over his own feet. He sprinted to the doctor, grabbing him by the shoulders. "Elena, is she—" "She's alive, but we have a complication," Aris said, his words coming fast. "We harvested the graft, but Mrs. Thorne has developed a coagulopathy. Her blood isn't clotting. She's hemorrhaging on the table." "Stop the surgery!" Julian screamed, his voice echoing off the tile walls. "Close her up. Save her." "We can't just close her up, Julian." Aris shook his head frantically. "The graft is already out. If we stop now to stabilize her completely, the liver segment dies, Sarah dies, and we still have to go back in to fix the bleed." "I don't care about the liver," Julian roared, shaking the surgeon. "I care about my wife. Do whatever you have to do to save Elena." "Dad, stop!" Bryce rushed forward, grabbing Julian's arm. "Mr. Thorne, listen to me." Iris grabbed Julian's wrists, forcing him to listen. "We are at a crossroads. I can perform a high-risk embolization to stop the bleeding while simultaneously transplanting the organ. It gives Sarah a chance, and it gives Elena a chance. But it pushes Elena's body to the absolute limit. The stress on her heart could be fatal." Iris pulled a clipboard from a nurse standing behind him. "Or," Iris continued, "we abort the transplant. We focus 100% on Elena. Sarah Chen dies within the hour, guaranteed." He thrust the clipboard at Julian. "I need consent to proceed with the dual procedure. I need you to sign the waiver. I need you to tell me if we are saving one life or trying to save two." The world narrowed down to the piece of paper. Julian looked at the dotted line. The ink seemed to swim before his eyes. If he signed, he risked killing the woman who had just taught him what love actually meant. If he refused, he murdered the woman he had loved first, and he destroyed the son he had just found. "Don't do it," Julian whispered, his hand shaking so hard he couldn't hold the pen. "I can't lose her, Iris. I can't lose Elena." "She told you." A voice came from behind him. Julian turned. Leo was standing there. He wasn't crying. He wasn't begging. He was standing with a terrifying calmness, looking straight into Julian's soul. "She told you," Leo repeated. "She said she wasn't doing it for you. She said she was doing it so another mother wouldn't die. If you stop now, you make her sacrifice meaningless. You make her a victim instead of a hero." Julian looked at Leo. Then he looked at Bryce. Bryce was crying, tears streaming down his face, but he nodded. "Mom wouldn't stop." Bryce choked out. "She's stubborn, Dad. She wouldn't stop." Julian looked down at the ring in his left hand. "Bury me next to Christopher," she had said. She wasn't afraid of death. She was afraid of living a life that didn't matter. If he saved her body but destroyed her wish, he would lose her anyway. She would never forgive him for letting the boy's mother die when she had given everything to save her. Julian let out a sound that was half sob, half growl. He snatched the clipboard. He didn't read the legal jargon. He pressed the pen to the paper and signed his name. It was the hardest signature of his life, harder than the check for his first building, harder than his marriage license. "Save them," Julian whispered, thrusting the board back at Iris. "Save them both. Or don't bother coming out." Iris didn't waste a second. He spun on his heel and disappeared back behind the swinging doors, trailing the scent of copper and antiseptic. Julian collapsed onto the bench. He put his head in his hands, clutching the diamond ring until it cut into his palm, bleeding a single drop of crimson that matched the blood on the surgeon's gown. And then the waiting began again. But this time, the silence wasn't empty. It was filled with the terrifying weight of a gamble that cost everything. Leo sat down next to Julian. He didn't say a word. He just stayed there, his shoulder lightly touching his father's arm. A small, solid anchor in the storm. The beep of the cardiac monitor was the loudest sound Julian had ever heard. It wasn't annoying. It was a hymn, a steady, rhythmic confirmation that the universe had decided, against all odds, to be kind. 3 days after the surgery, the intensive care unit was bathed in the soft, gray light of a Chicago morning. Julian sat between two beds, a sentinel who hadn't slept, shaved, or changed his clothes. To his left lay Elena, pale and fragile, her chest rising with shallow, painful breaths. To his right lay Maya, the yellow jaundice slowly fading from her skin, replaced by the faint flush of returning life. Maya's eyes fluttered open first. She didn't look at the machines or the tubes. She looked past Julian, straight at the woman in the other bed. Her gaze was cloudy with sedation, but it sharpened as she processed the sight of the bandage on Elena's side, the mirror image of her own. "She did it?" Maya whispered. Her voice was like dry leaves scraping together. Julian leaned in, taking Maya's hand. "She did. She saved you." Maya stared at Elena for a long time. There was no jealousy in her expression, no bitterness about the years lost or the life not lived. There was only a profound, silent reverence. "Why?" Maya asked. Elena's eyes opened then. She didn't turn her head. Movement was too agonizing. But she shifted her gaze to meet Maya's. The air between them crackled, not with tension, but with an unspoken pact known only to mothers who have stood on the edge of the abyss. "Because," Elena whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the ventilator. "I didn't want your son to be alone." Maya closed her eyes, a single tear tracking into her hairline. "Thank you," she breathed, "for his life, and for mine." "Don't thank me." Elena managed a weak, tired smile. "Just make sure he grows up to be better than his father." Julian bowed his head, accepting the jab. It was a fair price to pay. He held a hand of each woman, the past and the present, and for the first time, the timeline of his life didn't feel fractured. It felt complete. The recovery was not a montage of happy moments. It was grueling. It was slow. It was physical therapy sessions where Elena screamed in frustration, and dialysis appointments where Maya vomited from exhaustion. Julian wanted to move them all into the penthouse. He wanted to hire an army of nurses, chefs, and therapists. He wanted to smother the problem with money until it suffocated. Leo stopped him. "No," Leo said, standing in the foyer of the hospital on the day of Maya's discharge. He was holding the discharge papers, looking less like a street kid and more like a young man who had found his center. "We aren't moving into the tower, Julian." "It's safer," Julian argued, reaching for the luggage. "It's comfortable. I have a wing." "We don't need a wing." Leo cut him off gently. "Mom needs quiet. She needs a garden. She needs to smell paint and turpentine again, not floor wax and air conditioning." "I can buy a house," Julian offered immediately. "Anywhere you want." "No." Leo shook his head. "We'll stay in the apartment you rented near the clinic. I'll take care of her. I need to do this. I need to know I can take care of her without the magic checkbook." Julian looked at his son. He saw the pride there, the stubborn independence that was a direct genetic inheritance. He realized that pushing money at Leo wasn't helping. It was insulting. "Okay," Julian nodded slowly. "But on one condition. You let me visit. Not as a benefactor, just as a visitor." Leo smiled. It was the first genuine smile Julian had ever seen on the boy's face. It reached his eyes, crinkling the corners, just like Maya's did. "Yeah, you can visit. But bring pizza, the real kind, from Brooklyn, not that fancy stuff you eat." 1 year later. The wind off Lake Michigan usually cut through bone, but today the spring breeze was gentle, carrying the scent of wet earth and fresh sawdust. Julian Thorne stood on a small rise, looking down at the construction site. It was in the South Side, a neighborhood his firm usually ignored in favor of the glittering downtown skyline. There were no cranes reaching for the clouds here, no 60-story glass curtains reflecting the sun. The structure rising from the ground was modest. It was a low, sweeping building made of reclaimed timber and warm, rough-hewn stone. It curved around a central courtyard filled with old oak trees, designed to catch the natural light for the art studios inside. The sign out front, hand-painted on wood, read, "The Maya and Elena Community Arts Center. The truss is off by 2 inches." The shout came from the roof. Julian squinted against the sun. Up on the scaffolding, wearing a neon yellow vest and a hard hat that looked unnatural on his head, was Bryce. He was holding a tablet, pointing aggressively at a beam. "It's not off, you idiot. It's organic," came the yell from the ground. Leo was standing amidst a pile of blueprints, his hair tied back, covered in dust. He waved a roll of paper at Bryce. "It follows the curve of the tree root. Stop trying to make it a box." "It needs structural integrity, Leo," Bryce yelled back, climbing down the ladder with surprising agility. "If you want it to stand for 50 years, you listen to the engineer. And if you want people to actually feel something when they walk in, you listen to the artist." They stood chest to chest, glaring at each other. To an outsider, it looked like a fight. But Julian saw the truth. He saw the way Bryce handed Leo a water bottle without breaking eye contact. He saw the way Leo stepped back to let Bryce check the measurements again, trusting his judgment. They weren't fighting. They were collaborating. They were brothers, forging something tangible out of their differences. Julian felt a hand slip into his. Elena stood beside him. She was thinner than she used to be, and she tired easily, but her eyes were bright. She leaned against him, watching the boys. "They're loud," she noted. "They're passionate," Julian corrected. "Maya says the pottery studio's going to be too small," Elena said, adjusting her scarf. "Maya always complains about space." Julian laughed. "I'll expand it next year." He looked over his shoulder. Maya was sitting on a bench near the foundation, sketching the boys as they argued. She looked up and caught Julian's eye. She raised her pencil in a silent toast. Julian took a deep breath. For 30 years, he had believed that a legacy was measured in vertical feet, in awards, in the skyline he altered. He thought he was building monuments to his own greatness. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the old sketchbook, the one Leo had thrown at him that rainy night. It was battered, water-stained, and warped. He opened it to the first page, the drawing of the glass house he had never built. He took a pen from his pocket. Beneath the old faded inscription, "For Maya," he didn't cross anything out. He simply added a new line. The ink was fresh, dark, and permanent. "For Maya, who gave me the vision, and for Elena, who gave me the time." He closed the book. Down below, Leo and Bryce had stopped arguing. They were laughing now, bent over the same set of plans, pointing at the future they were building together. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't a skyscraper. It was messy and complicated and grounded in the dirt. It was the most beautiful thing Julian Thorne had ever designed. "Come on." Elena tugged his hand. "The boys are hungry, and I think it's your turn to buy the pizza." Julian smiled, pocketed the sketchbook, and walked down the hill toward his family. He wasn't the CEO anymore. He was just a man who had finally learned that the strongest structures aren't made of steel. They are made of the people who refuse to let you fall. Whatever you think of Julian's redemption, we can all agree that Elena is the absolute MVP of this story. But I have to ask you guys a tough question, and I want you to be honest in the comments. If you were in Elena's shoes, could you have done it? Could you risk your own life to save the woman your husband used to love? It's easy to say yes, but doing it is a whole different story. Let me know what you would have done down below. I read every single comment. And if this story touched your heart, go ahead and hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. We have so many more stories coming up about the messy, complicated, and beautiful thing we call family. You won't want to miss the next one.